Frontlines is the story of two groups of people who find their lives drawn together in unexpected ways. It begins with one team, which is Palco and Jira, who are police officers, and they're investigating a break-in, when suddenly Palco has a strange fit and finds that he's lost control of his actions. The other storyline involves Mike and Becca, who are young people living in a fairly typical contemporary world. Mike goes to a junk store, buys a notebook and pens, and discovers that although he has no artistic ability whatsoever, with this notebook and these pens he can draw with incredible skill. Eventually their stories start to come together, and they realize that there are some powerful tools at work here, and there are some equally powerful people who want to get their hands on those tools. And these two teams, who don't know each other at the beginning, will find their lives drawn together and will end up teaming up and doing some extraordinary things together. Well, the question of why I wrote this book is really a question of where I wrote it. I was living in Australia for a year in 2009, had a chance to spend a year there, and really wanted to do something that I hadn't done before. I've been working as a professional writer all my life, and wanted to explore writing a novel rather than short stories and non-fiction pieces, which I'd done previously. So I began exploring this story, and what I realized was that I was writing a children's novel as it began to take shape in front of me. I really tried to make the process of writing it very different than anything I'd done before too. I never write in longhand, and for this one I chose to do that for the first draft, which allowed me to write in very different places too. So much of this book was written in the first draft in pubs and coffee shops, and even some of it on the beach, which I think parts of that show up in the story. For the purposes of this story, there were certain places that I needed. I needed it to be set in a town that had a real downtown with some seedy elements to it. It needed to be a place that was large enough to have public transit so that Mike and Becca could get around, since neither of them drives, of course. But it needed to be small enough that there was the ability for them to move around on their bikes, and that there weren't necessarily constraints on their movements, that it was believable that they could have freedom to go downtown by themselves. So you sort of look around and say, well, where have you been? What place would be suitable? I ended up picturing, for many of the scenes, the place where I grew up, Strathroy and London, Ontario in particular. Many of the scenes I can actually point to buildings in London and say, that place is, that's Mr. Batty's store, that's the hospital, that's where the clubhouse is, where the confrontation takes place. And of course there are other places that are completely imagined, and there are elements of Australia that show up in there, and elements of Northern Ontario, and places in the US. You just kind of draw from different locations and build these scenes. People have always been interested in what police officers do. That's partly because they examine and explore all kinds of crazy situations and meet all kinds of interesting people. My dad was a policeman for many years, and I grew up hearing his stories about life on the beat. And I realized that those were formative stories, and they were stories that I carried with me for a long time. As I got older, I also realized that being a police officer is something that can make you very cynical and bitter and jaded. But it doesn't have to. I think the best cops and the best people, really, are those who take potentially adverse circumstances, but grow through them and become better people as a result. I think that was some of what my dad did in his job, and I think Palco shares some of those qualities as well. Well, with any story, you hope that you're going to inspire someone to do something a little bit differently, to examine their own lives and to think about who they are and how they're living. And that's part of the underlying message in this story, about the value of friendship, the value of pushing yourself beyond the boundaries of what you think you are capable of doing. But it's a story that's meant to entertain. And really, that's the ultimate goal of my story, is to entertain. Oh, there's so many neat storylines to be explored. I'm very excited about what happens next in the series. Partly because I think we've got some really neat characters going here. There's Rogos Gazins, the hippie scientist, who's definitely got some interesting personality to explore, and there's a darkness to him, there's an anger or bitterness and evil inside him that's hidden under this fluffy surface. There's Kariosh, the businessman, who's very driven and very dedicated to chasing down these tools of the artist. Mr. Batty, the old man with the junk store. There's all kinds of questions to be asked about him. And of course, Mike and Becca. They are the drivers of this. They're the kids who are making this story happen and who get caught up in it, and who will ultimately be responding to what happens next. So there's a lot of adventures still to be had.